And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
The ability of CO2 to do the heavy work of creating a climate catastrophe is almost nil at this point.
The price of oil has been artificially elevated to the point of insanity.
That's not how you power a modern industrial system.
The ultimate goal of this renewable energy, plan is to reach the exact same point that we're at now.
You know who's tried that? Germany. 7 straight days of no wind for Germany. Their factories are shutting down.
They really do act like weather didn't happen prior to 1910.
Today is Friday.
That's right, Greta. It is Friday. It's the best day of the week because it is the day that the Heartland Institute broadcasts this here Climate Realism Show. I'm Jim Lakely, Vice President of the Heartland Institute and your host. There is nothing else like the Climate Realism Show streaming anywhere. So I hope that you will like, share, and subscribe and leave your comments under this video as you watch it. These all convince YouTube's algorithm to smile upon this program, which gets the show in front of even more eyes. And as a reminder, big tech and the legacy media do not approve at all of the way we cover climate and energy policy on the Climate Realism Show. So Heartland's YouTube channel has been demonetized. So if you want to support this program, please visit heartland.org/TCRS. That's heartland.org/TCRS, which stands for the Climate Realism Show. And you can help us make sure that this show is happening every single Friday. Any support that you can give us is warmly welcome and greatly appreciated. We also want to thank our streaming partners that helps get this show in front of more people. That's junkscience.com, CFACT, and What's Up With That. Today we have a lot to cover, so we'll try to get through as much as we can, plus your questions and answers at the end of the show. And today we have with us, as usual, Anthony Watts. He's the Senior Fellow at the Heartland Institute and publisher of the most influential climate website in the world, What's Up With That. We have H. Sterling Burnett. He's the director of the Arthur B. Robinson Center on Climate and Environmental Policy at the Heartland Institute. And we also have with us Linnea Lueken. She's a research fellow for energy and environment policy at Heartland. And with us today, just to start the program off, we have a special guest. That's Tim Benson. He does energy policy and also education policy at the Heartland Institute. We're bringing him on at the top of the show here because he lives in Florida. And we were texting each other as the storm was approaching, and he was giving me updates on how things were going for as long as he hoped his power was going to hold out. Tim Benson is a resident of Stuart, Florida. He lives on a barrier island on the Atlantic side, but even over there, it was quite the storm to experience. So welcome, Tim. Glad you and your family are safe and sound, and that you have enough power to be on the program today.
Well, thanks for having me, everybody. It's truly a career highlight to be on the Climate Realism Show, so I can check that one off my bucket list. And so if there's one good thing to come out of the storm, it's clearly that this interview right now.
What? That's right. So Tim, I know that we were texting each other and you were giving you and your colleagues and friends updates on what was going on. There was the first band that came through had with it some pretty severe weather, and you talked about some tornadoes and the number of tornado warnings that you'd gotten you'd never seen before. Why don't you talk a little bit about what your experience was, even on the Atlantic side of Florida?
Yeah, sure. Well, just to fact check you a little bit, I don't live in Stuart anymore. I'm still on the same island, on Hutchinson Island, but I'm up in Fort Pierce on the north end of the island. It's like as you said, it's a barrier island. It's basically like a 20-mile long sandbar, and it's probably not more than a quarter of a mile wide at any point. So where to begin? Yeah, so for those of you just trying to figure out where that is, not listening in, it's so we're about 40 miles north of West Palm Beach. So if you go from Palm Beach to Jupiter Island to Hutchinson Island, that's where we are on the Atlantic coast. So yeah, we just had, normal sort of storm preparation. We weren't really sure how bad it was supposed to be because we were, based on every update of the track, we were like moving out of the cone, then moving into the cone, then moving a little farther into the cone, and then, slowly back out of the cone. So by Wednesday afternoon, when things really started picking up, we were outside of the cone, slightly outside of the cone. So you think, all right, well, it's not going to be that bad. And then, like you said, just kept getting these emergency warnings on my iPhone, like every 15 minutes, the really annoying ones that blare extremely loudly and they're hard to shut off and all that. And there's tornado warning, tornado warning, tornado warning, tornado warning. And honestly, most Floridians don't take this very seriously, just because we don't really get tornadoes that can cause significant damage like the ones that happened with this storm. Normally there's always tornadoes that come with hurricanes, but they're usually very, very small. Like you get water spouts and stuff like that, and maybe something that touches down that'll rip some shingles off of somebody's house or anything, but not like when people think, when people picture a tornado in their mind, a big ass huge thick tornado. Those are the ones apparently we're getting. I mean, I didn't know that on the island at the time. We just kept getting the updates, but nothing touched down here. But then you go online and you start seeing videos and stuff, and you start hearing reports of touchdowns, and it was obvious pretty quickly that this was something sort of unprecedented for our area. There's a community, a 55 plus, like a retirement community about 7 miles northwest of where I am on the mainland. And they took a couple direct hits. There were, I think, 6 dead in that community itself. There was tornadoes all the way down, big, very damaging tornadoes all the way down into Palm Beach County, which is 2 counties south of here. In Palm Beach Gardens, Wellington, seeing videos of cars being like smashed into houses and overturned and things like that. And, saw one video of a tornado crossing Interstate 95, and it looked like literally you were watching, like one of those Twister movies. And, a friend of mine had a tornado go through his backyard, didn't touch his house, but took out a couple trees, basically sent his kids a trampoline like 2 blocks over. Found it in a neighbor's yard a few blocks away. But it really took everybody by surprise. And with the tornadoes, there's nothing, Florida being so the water table being so high, there's no basements anywhere in South Florida, at least, and there might be some up in the Panhandle or anything like that, but the water table is too high to really do basements. So no one has a tornado shelter or warning. So when you get a tornado warning, there's no place you can really go other than an interior room and stand under a doorway. But if you get a direct hit from something, like especially the size of the ones we had that came in on Wednesday afternoon, I mean, you had no chance really. So that was really the worst of the storm for us. And that was before the storm even made landfall. Then it stopped raining around 4:00, and but that's expected. Like, rain comes and goes in hurricanes. It's not usually continuously, or especially when they're offshore. But we didn't get any rain again until like 10:30. We had another band come in, and that was about it. And then other than that, the wind just started picking up. As Milton came ashore and started moving east, and had some tropical storm force winds and some gusts. Nothing, no damage to me, but power lines down and branches down and stuff like that. We lost power for a few hours, but like I was telling you guys earlier, luckily I live like right next door to the mayor, so So my power was off for only about 2 or 3 hours. So pays to live by, people in authority.
So you've had hurricanes come in through the Gulf and cross the peninsula and past you.
Mm-hmm.
This is the worst storm you've experienced that's done that.
As far as the tornadoes, yeah. I mean, there's been hurricanes that have caused more damage. Like when we had Francis and Jean back in 2004. Mm-hmm. Francis was a Cat 2, Jean was a Cat 3, and they made landfall within 1.5 miles of each other within 20 days of each other. Wow. Which was so much fun for all of you out there. It was like everything just started getting back to normal, power back on and all that stuff from Francis, and then it was like, oh, by the way, here comes Jean. So yeah, that. But no, that was more substantial, like building damage and damage to wildlife and flora and all that kind of stuff. But we've never had anything like the tornadoes.
Yeah. All right. And so just before we let you go, how would you grade the recovery process at this point?
Well, I'm on the other coast, so it's not really that bad for us. I mean, other than the tornadoes, but it seems like it's going pretty well. On the West Coast. I mean, Florida. Luckily, we've had a string of very competent governors when it comes to storm management. It's basically like the one thing you can't mess up if you're a Florida governor. You have to perform well at the hurricane stuff and the recovery efforts and all that. So DeSantis has done a great job. They've had some pretty wicked storm surge on the Gulf. I know St. Pete got something like 18 inches of rain in a day, which is like biblical. So it's going to take some time for those beachfront communities there to recover, and some of the places that were in the path from all the way up to Orlando and Cape Canaveral and all that stuff. But this wasn't anything like Andrew or anything like that. It wasn't that bad. So it's just really, like I said, over here, sort of just a normal storm, other than the unprecedented size of the tornadoes that took everybody by surprise, and unfortunately, took out a lot of people. So
yeah. I mean, it's terrible, and I'm glad that you and your family are okay, because a lot of people around you are not okay. But even on the East Coast, so appreciate. I'm going to let you go here, Tim. I appreciate the update. Glad you're safe.
Yeah, no problem, guys.
Hopefully that's the last one you'll have to deal with this season, and we'll talk to you again. Oh, and by the way, Tim Benson has his own podcast. It's called Books with Benson. He interviews fantastic authors, mostly of historical books. So you want to check that out anywhere you can get podcasts. Books with Benson. So thanks a lot, Tim. Glad you're okay.
See you guys.
All right. And so we're going to bring in our special guest that's on the thumbnail and everything. And that is Stan Goldenberg. This is your second time on the show, Stan, in this hurricane season. Stan is one of the nation's leading hurricane experts. He's a hurricane specialist. He works for a pretty prestigious outfit. I'll just say that when it comes to hurricanes. And so, Stan, glad to have you on the show.
Great. And am I unmuted right now, I hope?
You are. Yes.
Yes. And let me just say, I'm doing this on my own time. This is my disclaimer. And not that I'm told not to, but I'm doing this on my own time. And my views do not necessarily represent those of my employer, even though they're really from most of the research that I really do there. But we'll just call it on my own time. And by the way, what Tim just said, those two storms, Florida got hit by 4 major hurricanes in 6 weeks back in 2004. Four major hurricanes in 6 weeks, and the 2 he mentioned were some of them on the east coast of Florida. So Florida hurricanes are nothing new. Florida getting hit by hurricanes are nothing new. And lots of rainfall with hurricanes is nothing new. And lots of damage, sadly. So we're going to get into all that as we continue on here.
We are. Although the subject is serious and the damage is serious and the loss of life is serious. We do have a segment on this show, and we enjoy it, and I know our audience does too. It's called the Crazy Climate News of the Week. And when it comes to this storm, there was quite a bit of crazy climate news. So hit the drop, Andy. All right. So that tickled Stan. And that's Bill Nye in our drop there on the Crazy Climate News of the Week. And as a matter of fact, Bill Nye got himself in the news and to our attention based on this storm. He was on CNN, and he had a particularly interesting message when it came to the storm and what humans can do. So why don't you play that video, Bill Nye, for us, Andy?
The other side, as we often call it, has no plans to address climate change, no plans for long-term dealing with these sorts of problems. If you have young voters out there, encourage them to vote. People say, what can I do about climate change? If we were talking about it, associating it with big storms like this, that would be really good. But the main thing is vote. Thank you.
And Bill, very quickly, how much of an impact do you see climate change playing in all of these explanations that you've given us? How much do you see climate change as being a part of that?
Oh, it's no question, everybody. Look, in climate science, everybody has been studying this for years. Everybody has been commenting, scientific papers have been written about how warm the ocean is around the Florida Peninsula. And it's this warm water that is driving these storms and enabling it to have to intensify so quickly. Everybody, be careful out there. Let's get through this.
Yeah. So that's my apologies. That was MSNBC, not CNN, although what the hell's the difference anymore? But Stan, I know that debunking this engineer and not an actual scientist is one of your favorite hobbies. So why don't you have first crack?
Well, actually, just let me mention terminology is important. And climate change is not the same as man-made or anthropogenic climate change, aka global warming. And that's the sad thing, is like the climate's always changing. That's what Patrick Michaels told John Stossel way back when, that opened eyes. The climate's always, when people say we're going to stop climate change, it's like, no way, no how are you going to stop the climate from changing? But as far as man-made climate change, there's studies and scientists showing the opposite view. And I personally do not believe we're seeing any substantial change or measurable change from climate trends, anthropogenic climate change, on hurricane activity, who happens to be my field of expertise. So I'll let you steer where you want to go.
Sure. Anthony, anything to add to Stan's observation? You're on mute, by the way. You're muted, Anthony.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, the only thing I can say, the first thing that came to my mind when I watched Bill Nye on MSNBC was the stupid, it burns. Seriously, he and a bunch of other people that call themselves climate scientists have swallowed this idea that climate change affects weather. They've swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. But the bottom line is that climate science in the form of the IPCC says there is no effect whatsoever on hurricanes. Zilch, zero, nada, not there. They published this in their AR6 report. And you'll find a table on my website on the right sidebar under, climate attributions and so forth. It's just not there. And the number of hurricanes is not increasing. The intensity of hurricanes is not increasing. And all this was disaster theater. That's all this was. They get a few people on and say, hey, climate change is making it worse, and doom is just around the corner, and we have to vote out climate change, as if you can actually do something, as if the earth actually gives a damn about what we vote for. It's just, it's insane. It is just absolutely insane. But then again, it's Bill Nye. So there you go.
If I could weigh in.
Can I jump in right away with that? Again, we're so used to saying climate change, which is man-made climate change for short. Changes in climate do affect how many hurricanes and the intensity we have. But those are natural fluctuations in climate. And
yeah, it's made less.
Right. And there's all sorts of stuff out there. And the thing is, this too is they can sit there and show all sorts of graphs and all sorts of charts. And I review papers sometimes and see other studies that seem to say this stuff is making hurricanes worse. And that's why the talk I gave, we should put the link up, from the your last Heartland conference in Orlando, is it really getting worse? And you have to really look at the data in a careful way. I'm going to give you one big example. I'll just throw this in right at the beginning. I've seen study after study that shows Atlantic hurricane activity starting in around 1970, going to the present. Why do they start in 1970? Because that's when satellite data started. You're better after that. The problem is that's the start of a low activity multi-decadal scale era that went for about 24 years. Then it switched to a high activity era. They start in the low, they end up with the high, and you get this massive trend that looks like everything is getting much worse. But if you pull back the curtain and look at the activity before 1970, you see another high activity era. So, I mean, this is still happening. People do this stuff and they don't understand there's a cycle, there's a clear cycle. But some do it out of ignorance. Some, I think, know what they're doing. So go ahead. Someone else wanted to say
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in. So, look, the reason the IPCC is important in this discussion is because we're often told that they are the gold standard. They are the experts. That's who you listen to. Now, the environmentalists are complaining they're not alarmist enough on hurricanes in particular. But the problem is, as Anthony said, look, it's not just the IPCC says they can find no fingerprint, no evidence that climate change is affecting hurricanes so far. They project outwards. They project with the worst case scenario, RCP 8.5, which they themselves now say is unrealistic and likely impossible. But even under the worst case scenario in 2050, they say we can attribute nothing changing vis-a-vis hurricanes to climate change. Then they look at it 2100. Well, maybe the climate signal will be then. Nope. That's not what the IPCC says. So when they call this group the gold standard, that tells me that Bill Nye is nowhere near the gold standard. He's like the lead standard. No one should listen to anything Bill Nye has to say about anything regarding climate.
Yep. Okay. And speaking of people who you should not listen to when it comes to climate, that's one Al Gore. He seems to enjoy exploiting extreme weather for fun and profit. So, producer Andy, can you play that Al Gore clip, please?
We saw the city of New Orleans devastated by Hurricane Katrina. We saw this city flattened in the south part of this city by Superstorm Sandy. We've seen the fires out. We've already seen so many catastrophic consequences that are exactly what the scientists predicted would occur, and yet it has not brought us across the political tipping point yet. I think that it will. I recently checked to see what percentage of Americans have been under an extreme weather alert during the first 8 months of this year. The answer, 100%. Every single person in the United States has been at one time or another this year under an extreme weather alert. And the extremes related to the climate are getting worse regularly. When I started giving my slideshows, Andrew, on climate, I would pick examples of the various impacts from 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Now, you can say, this was yesterday, this was the day before yesterday, this is going on right now. And right now, you pointed to this intensifying hurricane coming toward the Gulf Coast. But at the same time, we have once in a 1,000-year rainfalls in Central Europe, unprecedented fires in Portugal, unprecedented drought in Namibia, and I could keep going. It's happening all over the world. But frankly, the fact that it is global in its dimensions is one of the reasons it's hard for us as human beings to deal with it, because we're not used to thinking in that context.
Anthony Watts, there is a parade of misinformation, as the term goes, in that little clip. Maybe you could start highlighting and correcting some of it.
Well, one of the things I'll say about citing specific events, is that 50 years ago, we didn't hear about this stuff, right? And so that makes it all about climate change. No, it's not. What we've got is increased reporting of severe weather events around the world. We have the internet. We have people with cell phones all over the planet, and so any kind of abnormal weather event or curious weather event gets reported almost immediately. What does Al Gore do? Aha, climate change right there. See it? Yeah. It's not that. It's an increased reporting syndrome. We saw the same thing with tornadoes, tornado coverage is instantaneous now. 50 years ago, some tornadoes went through the middle of the United States and were never seen because they went through a cornfield or whatever, never reported. So it's just not true what Gore is saying. Severe weather is not getting worse, and there are several metrics in place from the scientific community that show that it's not true. Gore is just using it to push his agenda.
Yep. I mean, Linnea, you're the youngest person on this panel, and you were brought up in a education world where you probably had to sit there and watch An Inconvenient Truth in class. You might have been one of those. I know a lot of students had to. What do you think? And now that you've done so much research and are such an expert on climate and energy, when you listen to Al Gore?
I mean, we watched Inconvenient Truth like 3 times, I think. I mean, it was, one year after the next, especially around 2007, 2008, they were really pushing it pretty hard. Not entirely sure why. I think we might have been part of one of those like pilot programs where they were trying to inject climate into like every part of the curriculum in every class. So that was interesting. And that actually is pretty much what like red pilled me on the whole climate issue in the first place, is because you can't, even as a little kid, you're like, man, they just do not shut up about this. They're talking about it all the time. There is something weird about it. But yeah, no, it's Al Gore. I don't know what you want me to say, Jim.
Well, I mean, he's made hundreds of millions of dollars.
They just
tomorrow go on TV and say, I predict that Hawaii is going to explode by Friday. And then when it doesn't happen, no one will call him on it. So what he says is totally irrelevant.
According to Gore, there should be no ice at the North Pole right now. There should be no ice on Kilimanjaro. Tennessee should be burning up. It's just one lie after another. And most importantly, look, we toss around, we often hear the media toss around the word unprecedented, which means never happened before, never previously. But then Gore goes on to say it's unprecedented. Well, they're having a storm that's once in 1,000 years. Well, that means 1,000 years ago or sometime within the last 1,000 years it happened. Namibia, unprecedented drought. False. Even within human memory, they've had serious, dangerous, deadly droughts in Namibia. Portugal, wildfires, never happened. False. I mean, he says it. No one, it's like if it was a presidential debate and he were a Republican, they'd be fact checking his stuff. But when he says it, no one fact checks him. They just nod their heads and go, oh, yeah, you're right. It's unprecedented. Portugal's never had wildfires before. Oh, drought never occurred in Europe before. Look, these stones in the rivers, you can see them. And they're marked up showing when the last drought will hold it. If the stones are in the rivers and they have the markings on them showing 3 and 4 times in the past that you've had droughts like this, then it's not unusual or unprecedented.
Yep. Well, that is true. And like I said, we just wanted to highlight it because it's always every once in a while he's kind of like the groundhog. He comes out of a hole and spouts climate alarmism, and then he gets another $100 million. So that's kind of how that works. All right.
At least the groundhog's right about half the time. I can never find an instance where he's been right. So,
well, that's a very good point. All right, let's move on to our next one. This one is something that I really think I can't even believe we have to address this. And this is the idea that humans are able to manipulate either the creation, strength, and even direction of a hurricane. And this idea, it's mind-blowing. We talked about it last week, actually, on the show when it came to Hurricane Helene. And this thing has been spreading like a Portugal wildfire, I guess. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia has been talking about it. She talked about it during Helene. She has posts on X about it. She's doing it again here with Hurricane Milton. Alex Jones did an entire show on this. And like it or not, Alex Jones has millions of viewers and he has influence. Tim Pool, a millennial with a very popular show on YouTube. Again, millions of views each week. Just this morning, while preparing for this show, he had a live stream that was titled "Geoengineered Superstorms and Government Weather Control," and there were 20,000 people watching it. So this is something we could maybe even do a whole separate video debunking this whole idea and produced, and maybe we'll do that in the future. That's what we do here. That's what climaterealism.com website that we produce is also for. It's about the reality of weather and climate, and that's what we believe in, and not junk science and lies, which is what we're hearing on this. And so, actually, this morning I just put in the words search terms on X of Milton manipulation. And I ended up getting a stream of unending posts about how humans have somehow manipulated Milton to make it strike where it struck and to make it as strong as it was. So, Anthony, I know this really gets your goat, as it were. So I want to start with you on how do we debunk this? This is kind of crazy that this even has gotten going.
Yeah. Okay. So let's take a look at. Here's the picture of Hurricane Milton, right? So, it looks huge. It looks monstrous throughout the entire Gulf Coast. There it is, right? And, people see that and they look at the size of Florida compared to it and they think, oh, no, it's just going to totally devastate the state. But then there's the conspiracy theorists that get in there and they think, well, the government's pushing it into Florida for political reasons, for example, because they don't like Governor DeSantis. So let's just wreck the state and prove him wrong about climate change. That kind of rubbish is out there. But here's the deal. Here's the real deal. And when you look at the amount of energy involved associated with a hurricane like this, let's go to the next slide. A fully developed hurricane releases heat energy at the rate of 5 to 20 times 10 to the 13th watts. That's 5 to 20 trillion watts, which is equivalent to 10 megaton nuclear bomb going off every 20 minutes. I mean, now just imagine we're going to be able to steer something like that, with HARP or lasers from space or whatever. No, the disparity between the amount of energy in the hurricane and the amount of energy us puny humans can generate is mind-bogglingly different. It's just not, we can't do anything with it. And, when you look at the next slide and you see how much hurricane energy is released over its lifetime, power of 10,000 nuclear bombs over its lifetime, with energy primarily coming from the heat extracted from the ocean waters. A typical hurricane can generate energy equivalent to hundreds of times the total electric generating capacity of the planet. And somehow we're going to take all that electricity and shove it into the Gulf and make the hurricane do something, on the whim of the government. The absurdity is just mind-boggling. And yet people believe this junk, unfortunately.
No one on this podcast or this live stream distrusts the government more than I do, critiques the elites more than I do. But look, I follow the science. I've looked into stuff about geoengineering and geoengineering is different from storm manipulation, by the way. People seem to be confusing that with regards to the hurricane. But I've looked into this stuff because I've been interviewed 3 times this week on the topic. It's foolishness. It's dangerous. We've got enough things to critique the government for, enough problems the world faces without following the lead of people wearing tinfoil hats saying, see, it's the government again. They're killing people because they want to force us to acknowledge climate change. The government has the megaphone on climate change already. They don't need hurricanes to make that case, and they couldn't make the case using hurricanes if they wanted to, or tornadoes, or anything else for that matter.
Well, on that point, Sterling, if the government was, or like if the Department of Defense or something was creating hurricanes or making hurricanes worse in order to attack Trump supporters in Florida, which is the predominant theory that was floating around X this past couple of days. you would think that they would use this technology to show an increase in hurricane impacts in North America in order to back up the climate scam. You would think that the data would show an increasing trend in hurricane severity and frequency, or tornado severity and frequency, but there is nothing like that in the data. So what's the point? They can use this technology anytime they want, but they use it only right now, and they've never used it before to try and juice the climate scare.
Look at, look, Texas. There's no state pretty much redder than Texas. We haven't gotten hit by a hurricane. Asheville, North Carolina, as far as I can tell, is as blue a place in the state of North Carolina as can be. So they're literally directing it to destroy their own people and their own voting base. I have a feeling that in Asheville, it's going to be hard to vote after the storms. So it's mind-boggling how serious people are taking this.
Yeah. Stanley Goldenberg, I know that this is a topic that, gets your goat as well. And you are the hurricane expert. You work for a government agency that all you do full time is work on studying hurricanes, their history, their behaviors, their barometric pressure, all of that stuff. So maybe you want to take a swing at addressing this idea that humans can somehow have a significant impact on anything dealing with a hurricane.
Well, first of all, by the way, let me mention while I'm wearing this, I'm going to throw it in. Tonight starts Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, but also this is the week commemorating the October 7th massacre. Someday you'll do a whole program on why the left hates Israel. But going back to hurricanes now, let me just say this. I've studied hurricanes for over 40 years, flown into numerous hurricanes, worked with hurricane models, hurricane data, and I'm particularly an expert in hurricanes climate. That doesn't mean just anthropogenic climate change. That means fluctuations in climate. So this is what I do. This is what I study. But I want to jump, if you can you get my slides up there? I did send you some. Number 5, I want to show this one because this is a slide made by our former director, Dr. Hugh Willoughby, many, many years ago. What are the impacts of a Category 4 hurricane if it's landfall? So here, this one's coming from the east, whereas these other storms, came from the west. And what do you get? See, this is normal Hurricanes 101. You get, and people might not be see everything on there, but you have the area of devastating winds, the area of less devastating winds, but still tremendous disruption as far as power down and trees down and things like that. Then you have the blue, that storm surge, the wall of water that comes in, inundates the coast. And then you have inland flooding, which is what we saw, with the copious amounts of rain. And especially, where do you really get the flooding? Hilly areas, mountainous areas. It was no shock to see what happened in North Carolina. We've had, by the way, Hurricane Mitch hit Nicaragua, Honduras. It was a Cat 5, but when it hit the coast, it was only a Cat 1, sat there for a couple of days, mudslides, huge amounts of rain, killed 10,000 people. You had Hurricane Agnes, 1972, at that time, the costliest storm in U.S. history, 50 deaths flooding in the hills of Pennsylvania. You had Floyd in 1999, 85 deaths, all sorts of the deadliest storms since Agnes, not from storm surge, but from the inland flooding and the rain. And so you have, this is normal stuff. And by the way, the other thing on that diagram, for those who can read it, are tornadoes. These happen sometimes with hurricanes and with what storm we're talking about now, Milton. There was this band ahead of it that had heavier thunderstorm clouds than even around the eye wall. So I want to go back to, by the way, slide number 1. Okay, so I came in to where I work while they were still doing Project Storm Fury. I'm going to take a minute to focus on this because the wild theories out there, I've never seen so many people do it. And I'm going to give courtesy to those who are believing this stuff. I've seen some of the articles. I've seen a video from this guy, sounded like a total expert. He says, almost like the man-made climate change people, this is undeniable, irrefutable, and very calmly showed all these charts and figures and things. And if I didn't know my stuff, I might have even believed him. So I understand why some people are buying into this, but that is not what the science is saying. So Project Storm Fury, which was going on for decades, was a very careful project that attempted to create an outer eye wall. So in other words, you have the worst storms in the eye wall. It can be very relatively small. So what we do is we seed around that eye wall, trying to get those clouds to form and be more vigorous and to choke out the smaller eye wall. And it was only hoping to reduce the winds by 10 to 20 miles an hour. This was not to destroy the storm. And it was abandoned in the early 80s because the theory behind it, we happen to be a reputable lab and we believe the science when we see it. And through different measurements, we realized the theory, you have to have what's called super cold water droplets. And there was not enough to allow this to happen properly. And also the amount of natural variability we saw, which you go to the next slide, made it, oh, well, this is how we seed it. So you have the inner eye wall, and then you're trying to get the outer eye wall, and then the inner eye wall falls apart. So go to the next slide. This is Hurricane Allen, the first storm I ever flew in 1980. It went from that's the barometric pressure. So when it's low, the storm is stronger. When it's higher, the storm is weak. It went from Cat 5 to Cat 3 to Cat 5 to Cat 3 to Cat 5 to Cat 3, and without us doing anything. And we realized that it would be very hard, even if we were successful, to differentiate what we were doing from natural variability, which was so high. But it was also the super cold water droplets. And I was there when they wrote the rest in peace paper on Project Storm Fury. It said, we are stopping this. I was in the lab. They were doing all sorts of cloud seeding. It was a huge program. FACE, Florida Atlantic Cumulus, I forgot what it means, but they were doing all this kind of experiment. Top meteorologists from all over were there, and it was minimal success. I mean, they were very careful. They don't just boast about the stuff. So if you go to the next slide. Now, at the very bottom, we have an FAQ page, which for weather weenies, it's great to learn all sorts of stuff about hurricanes. And that's the website at my lab. But if you go down to, attempts to stop a hurricane in its tracks, it shows all sorts of different things that people are suggesting how to stop hurricanes. But we've been suggesting you can nuke them, you can drag icebergs, you can, moisture. This has all been thought about and talked about, absorbing material and many other things. And just like Anthony said, they failed to comprehend the size and the power of a storm. When he talked about the electrical energy, it's estimated, this is back of the envelope calculation, that the latent heat released in a hurricane in one day could power the electrical needs of the whole United States, not for an hour, not for a day, not for a month, but for 6 months. We're talking about massive, massive. You would drop a nuclear nuclear bomb on a hurricane and be like throwing a lady finger, for those who knows what that is, little firecracker, and the hurricane would just, yawn. That would be about it. So you can take the slides down. But let me say this: unequivocally, all these things that people are saying, that we are somehow steering them. Look, I was on the ground, where we're monitoring what's going on the planes, and I watched 4 flights and what was going on. We're seeing the actual data come in. We know the people that are out there. We know they're not doing any hanky-panky or whatever kind of weird stuff. We're observing this stuff. We're not changing it. And yes, people can think, especially with Carolina, they had to do something horrible. Remember a couple of years ago with Ian that hit the Southwest Florida coast? People were saying, yep, the government's trying to get revenge on DeSantis by sending this, storm in. They're not changing the hurricanes. Hurricanes happen. And you bounce back to the man-made climate change. Is that affecting hurricanes? It's like, I'm sorry, the evidence is not there. There's models, there's runs, there's all these sorts of things, but those are models. The kind of activity we're seeing now, we've seen in the past. We've seen different kind of things. Each catastrophe is a little bit different. Each one's a little bit different. But this, you remember, you had me on back in, August. Why is this season not busier? And Did we blow our above average forecast? And I said, well, the season's not over yet. Things can happen. And sure enough, it hit mid-September, late September, and bam, 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 bam. And we had huge amount of activity. That's not, you always break records. Whatever record you have, you can always break it. That doesn't mean it's something weird. Records are meant to be broken. So yes, I do not believe anybody's going out there. I would love Anthony to address so-called chemtrails. That's what people come to me all the time and are they're doing all this stuff up there, and
makes my head hurt every time I hear the word chemtrails.
I want you to take a minute or two to address that. Do you mean the government is not putting all these chemicals in the air? What are those streaks we see in the air, Anthony? Don't you know what they are? I hear this all the time. Tell us about it. Tell us about it, please.
Chemtrails are not what people believe them to be. They're simple things. It's just simply the combustion process in a jet engine. So we have oxygen and jet fuel. They go together in the jet engine. They burn. When jet fuel, a hydrocarbon, burns, it releases carbon dioxide and it releases water vapor. Now, at altitude, when the temperature is minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, where these jets are flying, what happens to water vapor that's ejected from the back of the jet engine? It immediately freezes. And depending upon the relative humidity of the atmosphere at that level, it may linger for a long time, if the relative humidity is high. But if the air is very dry, it might disappear or not even show up at all. And so, and this can happen when they fly through different layers of the atmosphere, and people that look up in the sky and they see these jets flying along and there's this trail coming behind them and then it stops. Well, their minds go immediately to, there's a chemtrail switch in the cockpit and they shut it off. No, it's just they went to a different pocket of air that was drier. So, and imagine how many people would have to be involved to keep a secret like this. But anyway, it's just simply ludicrous. But let's go back to Project Storm Fury if we can. Stan was right. They tried all kinds of different things, and there's a website that NASA, or rather NOAA, has talking about this, and they talk about what was Project Storm Fury. And they were trying to reduce the intensity of hurricanes through a number of different methods. I mean, they tried cloud seeding. They even considered putting nuclear bombs in the atmosphere, all kinds of schemes. And I remember very, very well in 1975, 76, when I was at the meteorology department at Purdue, I asked one of my professors, well, what about dropping a nuclear bomb into a hurricane? He had the same reaction I had to to chemtrails. It's like, oh, every time I hear that, So the amount of energy in one nuclear bomb is minuscule compared to the hurricane. Let's go back to that slide that I had earlier in the broadcast, where we talked about the amount of energy involved. A hurricane releases an enormous amount of energy, often compared to the power of 10,000 nuclear bombs over its lifetime. So imagine dropping one nuclear bomb into a hurricane at any given time. Yeah, it might make a blip, but it's not going to change its path. It's not going to cause it to disintegrate. And it's the same thing with cloud seeding. There's just so much energy involved in these things. These things are behemoths. We can't really stop them.
There might be one impact if you dropped a nuke in a hurricane, and that would be to scatter radiation.
Absolutely, lots of fallout
over a lot of fallout, and that doesn't seem like a good idea to me, regardless of its impact on hurricanes.
And that's not a minor thing, because a hurricane's like a chimney, and that stuff in the middle goes up and then out through the outflow and could cover hundreds, if not thousands, of miles.
Yeah.
So
right. I wanted to point out too to our audience, because I know that there's probably some people who have kind of fallen in with some of this stuff. If you don't have the background information to understand, or the physics information to understand why this stuff is improbable, it would, as Stan said earlier, it would be really easy to believe. But I see a lot of people pointing to things that are real like cloud seeding, like patents for weather modification machines, and which I think is actually one of the worst arguments for the weather modification thing, because there are literally patents for like time machines and stuff. So I wouldn't base my opinions off of the existence
Wait,
of
I want
patents.
one of the time machines. Where can I get that?
Yeah, I know, right? And then there are experiments that have been done and are talked about in the media all the time, that are geoengineering experiments to try and scatter like chalk dust or silver or something into the atmosphere in order to reflect sunlight back to produce global cooling. That stuff is real, but it's not anywhere near the same ballpark as changing the direction or increasing the intensity of a hurricane. And Stan, I have a question for you, because I saw this pop up in comments all over the place on the internet. And I think that this is a case of people who shouldn't be giving the alarmists this like bone. A lot of people are saying that the reason why they think that this storm was created or modified by the government or whatever is because they say it went from a category 1 to a category 5 in like 12 hours. Can you explain why that like would or wouldn't be an indication that there's something fruity going on, or is that rare? Is that something that's unprecedented? That's the question I have.
They're going to bring me up somehow here.
Yep.
Okay. It's called rapid intensification. And I have one of the top experts on rapid intensification, works right down the hall from me. I'll throw out his name, John Kaplan, but and also Mark DeMaria, who I knew. And records are made to be broken. And you have all the Cat 5 storms that hit the United States were tropical storms less than about 60 hours before landfall, some even 36 hours before landfall. You have Cat 5 storm that hit Acapulco. Was that last year, I think? And suddenly revved up. Sometimes when they're smaller, and Milton was very small when this happened. It got bigger later. When they're smaller, it can get its act together quicker. And all the conditions come right, it can rev right up. Also, one of the key things with understanding hurricanes and why I do not believe they're getting worse, they're getting more damage because more people build in harm's way, is that people don't understand the historical database. And whenever I give a talk, like the talk I gave in Orlando, whenever I give a talk, I have to show how things have evolved on how we measure these storms. So if you look at the fact that I know I'm giving a long answer, but this goes with everything else. I mentioned that since 1995, we've been in a high activity era, and we've had good satellite data. Well, that's the first time we ever observed a high activity era. And these eras have 2 to 3 times as many major hurricanes. Those are the ones with rapid intensification. So we never observed those. And the aircraft data back in the previous high activity era, which ended in 1970, even the aircraft data wasn't near as good as we have right now. And it keeps changing and changing. I've watched it in my 40-year career, almost like coming out of the Stone Age compared to what we have right now. So that's the thing. When they say, I hate when they say, this is the strongest hurricane ever in the Atlantic. That's never true. It's the strongest hurricane measured by some parameter. So there might have been a stronger one before. The 1935 Labor Day storm, which was 895 millibars, Cat 5 storm that hit Florida Keys, they had just a few barometric pressure measurements and the damage. Then you had Dorian a few years ago, and that was flown more than any hurricane we've ever had in history by all sorts of sophisticated instruments. So we really knew how strong that was. Same with Milton. We were out there dropping all sorts of instruments. They dropped an unmanned drone, which flies near the surface. This is some of the latest technology. Flies around, measures some of the strongest winds right near the surface. We're dropping all sorts of instruments. And by the way, we also dropped the ashes of a dear colleague of ours, burial at sea during Milton, Peter Dodge. But that was a very tearful moment. We have emotional things too on the planes, and he was very well known. But the point is, we're measuring this stuff like we've never measured before. So I can look back on busy years before and know we don't know even exactly how strong some of the storms were. So Does that answer your question? Long answer, but it has to do with other stuff we've been talking about.
100%.
Yeah, we just brought up a slide here that's from Chris Martz on Twitter, and just look at the central pressures of these landfalling hurricanes, and where Helene is. It's number 8, and Milton down at number 19. So the Labor Day storm, Michael and Andrew, and the Florida Keys and the Okeechobee storms were much more powerful, and they happened a long time ago, except for Michael. So yeah, the intensification just isn't there. It's not in the data.
Yeah. Well, let's break down Milton a little bit more here while we have the time here. And if you bring up that other ex post, Andy, of like 2 idiots on CNN, Anderson Cooper and Bill Weir, reporting from the ground. Reporting from the ground there in Florida, getting blown around. Our friend Ryan Maui, calls this cartoonish coverage, and that it certainly is as they're getting blown around. But this is why
disaster theater.
That's exactly right. So this is why it's so great to have Stan as a friend and on the show, and Anthony as well as a meteorologist. But let's talk a little bit about the idea that the hurricane was getting so powerful so quickly in the Gulf, as Linnea brought up. It even made a meteorologist on camera in Florida, break into, he almost cried because he couldn't believe how strong the storm was getting. And they said, guys, that we needed a new category now, a category 6 hurricane to describe this storm. And then, of course, the parade of more powerful storms that will now be routine in the Atlantic and in the Gulf. But Anthony, as you were looking into this, it may not be the case, and you and Stan can speak to this, that Milton was a quote unquote major hurricane, which is Cat 3 or above, when it actually made landfall.
Yeah. Before we get to that, I want to say one thing. Just watching Stan's reaction and mine earlier, I think this show has a record for the number of face palms in it.
For sure.
Some of this stuff is just hysterical.
All right, so here's one of the things that I've noted, and several other people have noted, like Ryan Maui and Chris Martz and other folks, that when the NHC issues a maximum sustained winds in their reports, for example, they said Milton reached landfall as a Cat 3 hurricane with 120 mile per hour sustained winds. That's just 9 miles per hour over a Cat 2. But when you look at the data on the ground, you look at the weather stations that were measuring wind speeds, we were seeing wind speeds when it made landfall of 70, 80, 90, maybe just a tad over 100 miles per hour. And so one of the things that is a concern is NHC is out there reporting, Cat 3, but the reality is something like Cat 1 to Cat 2. And so that builds up a mistrust with people. And I think it has to do with the fact that, they're looking down at this by satellites, and they're looking at the rotation, and they're measuring the velocity from that. They're measuring the velocity from the hurricane hunters, which are inside the eye where it's going to be max, but they're also measuring at altitude. Winds at altitude are much stronger than winds at the ground due to friction. And so, Stan, how do we deal with that? How do we get a more accurate presentation to the public that really represents what this hurricane is going to do when it makes landfall?
Let me make an important quote. I'm glad you asked that question. And I happen to be looking at the aircraft data from the ground. There was a number of us on a Google Meet interacting with the airplane, seeing all the data, even up to landfall. We were watching it as it was made landfall, which thankfully it weakened. And from you saying this, I am actually going to shoot this to the Hurricane Center and encourage them to emphasize this point. When they say the max winds, by the way, we are measuring at the surface. We're dropping drop zones, and it measured, that started in 1997. Before that, we didn't have that. So they're literally measuring it right at the surface, and they know what they're doing. We're very experts with these instruments. It means somewhere at the surface, 10-meter height, there are 1 minute sustained winds of 120 miles per hour. What needs to be communicated to the public more is not everybody's going to get those winds. And of course, as soon as it moves on to land, this is when it made landfall. It's at not Sebastian, what was the key? Right there at the coast. Sorry, I just saw what they put on the screen. Distracting. But the point is that somewhere there were those winds at the surface. but it starts to weaken as soon as it moves over land, and not everybody gets that. So they need to communicate that. Thankfully, everybody doesn't get it. Now, let me say one other thing. Hurricane Center is a very honest operation. They will do post-analysis. They'll pull back all the data together and look over it again. And a few months from now, they might decide, it was really 105 miles per hour of landfall. Or with Hurricane Andrew, 10 years later, they upped it from Cat 4 to Cat 5, looking at all the data. So Katrina, they dropped it from a 4 to a 3 at landfall. I mean, there's all these things going on, but they're doing the best they can. And we certainly saw winds of that intensity as it was making landfall from the aircraft surface measurements. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah. But one other thing I want to address with you, Stan, since I've got you on here and you're going to talk to the people at NHC about it, is I've had a number of comments on Twitter, Facebook, and so forth from people that are looking at the graphics, the warning graphics, for example, the static cone graphic that are produced by NHC. And they say, well, this is almost useless because it doesn't have the level of granularity for me to determine where this is at, compared to where my town is. And so what I was doing is I was downloading the Google Earth file, the keyhole markup language KMZ file, and overlaying that on Google Earth. And I was able to determine for a lot of people where the track really is going to likely be and how close it's going to be to their town. And people were relieved about that. But it seems to me, and I'm not trying to fault NHC because I know change is difficult, but it seems to me that in terms of producing relevant and useful graphics, NHC is behind the times by about 10 to 15 years in their presentation to the public. What do you think?
Okay, let me defend the folks at NHC. They add graphics. In fact, they just added a new one. If you go to the cone, above it, it says experimental cone. I mean, they're looking into it, which is showing the warnings and watches inland. It's an excellent product. I'm excited. They have all sorts of great products. But because their products are viewed by so many people and media, they have to do it extremely carefully when they do this, so it's not misunderstood. I happen to agree with you that I wish the map had more resolution. I did the same. I pulled up a Florida map. I want to know which cities were where. I was trying to figure it out, and there's nothing on that. They might have their reasons for it, but they have a PDA, with Public Service PSA, on their main page that gives you a video talking about the cone. I mean, they really try and communicate and educate the public, but there's so much misinformation out there. They have to fight it all the time. And just like people see the cone, and that's not the edge of where the hurricane's going to affect people. That's just the edge of where they think the track might be, but it can go out 100 miles from that. So there's all sorts of Hurricane 101 that we need to educate the public on. That's what you're here for, Anthony.
Yes.
Thank you, Stan.
But I'm going to mention that map thing to them. I was like, can't you put a few cities on there, something, if we were have a version with all the cities on it?
One of the things here's one of the things I would recommend. If you want to keep that same map format for the static cone, just make it super high resolution and then, offer a small thumbnail version on the website. Then people can click in it. And when it expands, it's much greater resolution and they can see more detail. I think that would be tremendously useful to the public. Right now, it's just these low resolution graphics and it's not really as useful as it could be.
Yeah, very seriously. I don't work at NHC, but I know the people there. And if you email me your suggestions, because some of those are good suggestions. By the way, let me mention one thing so I don't forget about Hurricane Helene. I happened to be flying into Greenville, South Carolina, the day the storm passed through that area. It had already gone, and I was there, thousands of trees down. I saw a house half smashed by a tree, power out for 3 days. We were just an hour south of the horrible flooding. But one of the other reasons that flooding happened up there, again, not man-made, but what happened is there was this trailing thing, just like with Milton. You saw all that rain ahead of the storm for hundreds and hundreds of miles, maybe even 500, 700 miles ahead of the storm. And while I was interacting with the front, that's what was going on with Helene. For days before the storm even got there, they were having a lot of rain. So the ground was super saturated. And then, and in fact, that's what happened with some of the others, where one hurricane comes in, totally saturates everything, and then another hurricane comes in a week or two later, and you have the massive flooding. But that's what happened in Carolinas, combined with the fact that there's mountains. So thank you.
Good Good
Yeah.
point.
All right. Well, we got a lot of questions to get to, and we're already over time a little bit. We're going to get to that, but as Linnea prepares to pick out the questions to ask, we have we didn't do our meme of the week here, our cartoon of the week, and so this is from Scott Adams. Robots Read News, and it's recent hurricanes are being blamed on climate change or possibly government geoengineering. Robot Reads News say ridiculous, or possibly a 2020 change in maritime fuel standards that caused warming in the Gulf, or maybe exhaust from UAPs. That's nonsense and conspiracy theories. Other possible causes are the Cuban Bean Festival and racism. Oh, and all of Trump's words. Only a science denier would disagree with all of that. So a little levity before we get into the Q&A.
That is great. Thank you.
Sharing it, Anthony.
Yeah, this is a case of truth is stranger than fiction.
It is in this case. This week, I think it is. All right, Linnea's Q&A time. Let's hit it.
All right, awesome. I have a couple of comments in here related to weather modification that I tagged along with the questions, just because these are common claims that I see online, and because I do not have the background to understand where they're right and where they're wrong, or how they're extrapolating this into ridiculousness, or if they might be onto something. I did tag some of them so that we can address them, because I think Anthony in particular will have answers for the radio frequency question, which is, this individual says that weather is electrical, so radio frequencies can change weather physics in an instant. True or false?
False. False. Way false. Look, Stan's laughing. But, I understand people coming up with these ideas. I get it. I understand you want to make sense of all this stuff. But the reality is that you cannot modify the weather significantly with radio waves. There's just no interaction. And the vibrational modes of water molecules are not in the regular radio frequency spectrum, like AM broadcast, FM broadcast, that sort of thing. They're up in the microwave band. And so, but even then, if we shot microwaves into the sky, we're already doing that with radars, and we've learned to avoid sending out radar waves at the frequency at which water molecules vibrate, because what happens is that the radar becomes useless. So we don't really excite the atmosphere or change it with radio waves. It's just not happening.
Let me give you a quote. This is a quote by Thomas Huxley. The great tragedy of science, the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact. And we deal that all the time with our lab. These things aren't ridiculous. Some people are thinking of reasonable stuff. Why can't we do this? Why can't we do it? There was a whole Project Storm Fury. That was one of the most carefully thought out scientific experiments we've done on a large scale like that. But why did it finally stop? Because we finally collected enough data, saw enough things that, it was slayed by an ugly fact, and that's, radio waves. We'll try pointing mega radio waves at a bolt of lightning and see if you can change it. Okay. I mean, we're talking about things, and nothing out there can do any major stuff to the weather. Nothing man-made right now can do that. Even the cloud seeding. You're not talking about major changes. Go ahead. Next,
right. Just remember, we're puny humans.
Yeah, kind of related is the NexRad thing. I've seen people claiming that NexRad is able to be used in for this purpose. What's NexRad?
All right, so let me tell you about radar. This is what most people don't understand. They think that radar is a continuous beam of 750,000 watts going out, frying the atmosphere every time it sweeps around. No. It uses a pulse repetition rate, and the pulses are in the microseconds of duration. And so it'll pump out a 750,000 watt pulse. That's a microsecond or two wide. And it does that listening for an echo. And so the amount of power dissipated over time is actually quite small because of that.
Thank you, Anthony. All right. This one is another on the same in the same category that I think I'm going to pitch to Sterling, because I recall that he had something to say about this. LT Oracle of Truth says John Brennan, director of the CIA, said that in 2015 he was very interested in solar radiation management that would mimic a volcanic eruption to cool the planet. I've seen these videos going around a lot.
Yeah, that's one of the things that was brought up to me in a radio show this week. They sent me the video. It's like, my first thought, I don't like to attack a person, but rather their argument. But this is John Brennan. He was the lead spook for the United States, which means part of his job was lying for a living. He pushed the Russian dossier that we know is all false. And so why would anyone trust what he has to say about climate modification? But what he talked about was putting basically sulfates into the air, sulfur particles. And he said, like mimicking volcanoes. And that was to reflect sunlight to cool the earth. That wasn't to control hurricanes or any storms. It was simply to basically put a blanket of pollution into the air to cool the earth. This is one of those geoengineering things they keep bringing up. Now, we did that for 80 years. It was called coal-fired power plants. We actually got a benefit from it. They were producing energy, reliable energy, but they put sulfates into the atmosphere. Now we put scrubbers on them and we cut down that a lot. You know, they were producing acid rain, so we cut down that a lot, but they were still operational. Now we have removed that. When we shut down the power plants, we've removed it from the shipping fuel, which is one of the reasons the surface of the ocean has warmed. Recent research suggests. The point is, we could go back to coal plants and let them spew the stuff into the atmosphere, and we wouldn't have to pay $10 billion of taxpayer money every year to do it. But that has nothing to do with weather modification. It's a geoengineering solution for what I think is a non-problem climate change.
Thank you, Sterling. Okay, so this is a question that's kind of part of a series of questions from Luke Starkenberg, and he wants to know, where does this misinformation come from? And also, why does it seem like Republicans are primarily the ones who believe in this kind of like chemtrail geoengineering stuff? My answer to that would be, I actually don't. Well, it might actually be primarily people on the right, but I have seen people on the left pushing this stuff too, generally in the like hippie anti-development kind of area. But what do you guys think?
I think it has to do with mistrust of the government in general, which has been on the increase. People mistrust the government to do something in their best interest these days. And that has been increasing for the last 40 years. And so when we see these kinds of events happen, they think that, well, the government is doing this to us to punish us. That's some of the thinking.
Yeah, remember, so in the 60s and early 70s and before, it was the left that mistrusted the government. They mistrusted the man. They said, we got to keep an eye on them. You know, during the Vietnam War, the Tuskegee experiments, the LSD experiments that John Brennan's CIA carried out. So it's just shifted. It's mistrust of the government. I think the right always mistrusted the government some. But as the government has grown into ever more areas of our lives, telling us who can use what bathroom, telling us your children aren't yours if we decide you're not affirming their gender, telling us that, well, yeah, people crossing the border are breaking the law, but we won't call them illegal, and we're going to give them a pathway to citizenship. Basically, people on the right say, you're breaking the law, you're interfering with our traditional exercise of authority, and so they distrust the government more right now. But you're right. There are a lot of people on the left that believe this stuff too. I hear about contrails from people on the left and right.
Okay, let me mention a couple comments of that. Number one, the old Joseph Goebbels quote, Hitler's propaganda person. If you repeat a lie enough, people believe it, and you will even come to believe it yourself. But the issue is that because of the internet, because of social media, these things get repeated thousands and thousands and thousands of times. You see it, other people share it. I deal a lot with promoting inspirational films. And there was a film that a woman went to one of the screenings, posted some negative stuff about it, which was very distorted. It got picked up, shared something like 50,000 times, and it really affected the revenue of that movie. And it was misinformation. So that stuff gets repeated. Also, like you said, the distrust of the government, And this is the other key thing. People are shocked by disasters. And you see all this stuff again and again and again. People gasp at the destruction in North Carolina. They're shocked at what happened with Katrina. They're shocked even at this one. People get shocked at that, and they want a reason. Why are we suddenly seeing this disaster? People like me or historians that have worked in the field are not shocked by it. We're saddened, but we're not shocked. We believe these things can happen. Hurricanes happen. But that is the other reason. It's hard for people to comprehend how bad things can be, like with these hurricanes.
That and social media has become the great amplifier of lies and disinformation.
Yeah, and like we were, I think someone in the chat said before, you know, the interesting and fun, cool ideas, whether it's the space lasers causing fires in Hawaii or the government manipulation of the hurricanes or whatever, that's way more interesting than we had a bad storm. And so people will elevate that stuff.
Now the thing is, not that they're causing the stuff, but how they're responding to the disasters, like in Hawaii, how they're responding to the disaster in North Carolina. And comment after comment came from people on the ground, how they were being resisted on certain private efforts, and how FEMA, as we've heard, was doing so little. The point is, some of that stuff is real, but the cause behind the disasters is not. And we have to, disasters happen and we have to prepare ourselves for it.
Stan, this is for you. I'm going to shift us back onto the hurricane specific topics, but LT Oracle of Truth asks, the reverse storm surge amazed me. What factors occurred to cause that phenomenon?
Oh, that's a great question. I assume they're talking about Tampa Bay.
Yeah.
And yeah, what happened? Oh, you got my juices going. Even just talk about it. It was not only that.
It was Ross Perot.
It is exciting. I got excited when I saw this question too, because it's really cool.
This is the first time I've been so involved in some of the flights. I wasn't doing any measurements. I wasn't processing anything, but I was just observing. So I was on the meet, and you know, I've done it so much in the past on the plane. This is the first time on the ground like this. So I was watching everything, and we're watching very carefully. How is it going to hit Tampa Bay? Because that is the disaster waiting to happen. Because if it would be slightly to the south, then I'm sorry, to the north, then the winds would be onshore, therefore pushing all the water in up into those bays and inlets. It would be just a mega disaster. But if it's a little bit to the south, like it was, they get offshore winds, so it pushes the water out, and you get this negative storm surge. But when the storm passes, then the stuff comes sloshing back. And I've seen actually storm surge models that show different scenarios, storms hitting different directions. And they showed one where after the storm totally left, then the max storm surge happened. So the direction, whereas the east coast of Florida was getting mainly onshore winds. So they were getting a decent amount of surge. And south of the storm, down towards, I forgot some of those cities down there, but south of the storm, they were getting onshore winds and they were getting the flood. But that's a great question, because
do you know how far they were pushing it out?
Well, before we get off of that,
I just know it went down a few feet. I don't know exactly how far. I haven't studied it. I've had my hands so full the last few days. I don't know what day it is.
I bet.
Yeah. Before we get off of this subject, I want to point out that my guy Friday, Charles Rotter, for What's Up With That, he lives down in along the East Coast around near Miami.
Right.
And he was reporting. Yeah. And he was reporting that even at low tide, there was, some flooding going on. And he was baffled by this. And I said, well, it's most likely, and back me up on this, Stan, if I'm right or wrong, but most likely it had to do with once Milton went off to sea, it created a bulge of water that it was sucking up, due to the low pressure. And then as it moved further away, that bulge relaxed. And then you got this wash of water coming up against the coast. Is that right?
I don't know in this particular case. Remember, I'm a careful scientist with this, so I'm careful what I say. But it is when you have a storm out at sea, like for instance, you had Kirk. Was it Kirk a week or two ago? It was a massive hurricane, and it didn't get near land, but it generated huge swells all along the eastern coast of the U.S. So you have a hurricane, whether it's the bulge relaxing and going, or just simply the stuff generating out from the hurricane. You have a lot going on with the oceans with these things. And by the way, the reason they beg people to evacuate, they have to hope for the best but prepare for the worst, is because the hardest thing to escape is the flooding. Whether it's storm surge flooding, which can come in very quickly and rise several feet, like, you just kind of blink and it's coming up and it's hard for people to get away from, or the inland flooding, from the copious amounts of rain, like in the mountains and things like that. Flooding is the deadliest part of the storm. It's easier to hide from the winds than it is from the flooding. This is great. Go on. Good question.
Yeah, this question from Itisi Toe. I don't know. I hope I pronounced that right. I probably didn't. Who says, why do hurricanes lose energy above land?
Oh, that's great. These are really good questions. Kudos. Because the source of the enemy, as we've been saying, source of the energy we've been saying, is the latent heat release. For those who don't know what that is, that's when the moisture in the air rises and it cools off. The water vapor condenses, and when it condenses, it releases what's called latent heat of condensation or evaporation. So the energy that drives that hurricane is the water vapor that they get from the ocean. As soon as you get over land, you not only have more friction on the ground, which can slow the winds down, you cut off its source of energy. That's exactly it. Occasionally, when something like went right over the Everglades. So Hurricane Andrew came from the east, went over the Everglades, and weakened very little. It came out as a Cat 3 on the other side because there was a lot of moisture there. But you got to have that warm ocean to fuel the hurricane.
Thank you very much. You're going to like this one too. I just lost it. Hang on. Oh yeah. When you say airplane wind speed measurement, how is that done? Seems like 10 feet off the ground is pretty close.
I get so much laughing done on these forums. But that's right. What happens is the official surface wind speed is defined as 10 meters off the ground, which is 30 feet. It's actually a little less right near the ground. What happens is, in the old days, we would fly the plane and we had an equation that we would reduce the winds at flight level, because like Anthony said, they're higher at flight level. So say we're flying at 5,000 feet. So we'd multiply 0.7 times the winds to estimate what was going on the surface. But starting in 1997, we started using GPS drop wind signs. And these things are amazing stuff. I was on the first flights they were ever launched into a hurricane, and they go down and they can measure all the way to the surface very accurately the wind. So that's how we know what's going on the surface. We also have something called a microwave scatterometer. The NOAA P-3 aircraft are some of those heavily instrumented aircraft in the world, with lots of professionals out there. By the way, I want to say publicly kudos to all the people involved. I was not on the plane. I was on the ground. The crew and the scientists on the plane, and the National Hurricane Center doing their job, and National Weather Service people getting out the word. I mean, the people at the Hurricane Center day and night, and they've got such pressure because lives are at stake, and they take that very seriously. So you can send up an appreciation to them. But that's how. So we actually have measurement, and the microwave scatterometer actually measures winds at the surface from the ocean condition. And we use the drop signs, and they compare things to each other to get the measurements. We have all sorts of ways we actually, let me tell you, in the old days, in the 40s, 50s, when they were flying, how did they measure the surface wind speed from the plane? They had a little transparent bubble underneath the plane. I know someone who flew in that on Navy planes, and they would look at the ocean surface and they would estimate how strong the winds were by looking at the ocean. So they had all sorts of charts. And by the way, why we don't trust some of the old measurements, this guy would say, come back, and his commanding officer would say, no, it can't be that strong. And they knock the winds down. So all sorts of ways to measure. Thank you. Great questions.
Awesome. Okay, this is a question I'm going to throw at pretty much everybody, what they think about it. And that is from Slartibart Fast, who says, is the hurricane manipulation narrative a deliberate disinformation campaign to poo-poo the climate deniers? What I would say to that is that I find it very bothersome when the right is parroting the like unprecedented language when it comes to these storms in order to push the idea that the government is manipulating the weather. I saw The Blaze, for instance, was pushing the idea that weather is becoming more erratic and unpredictable. And they say, and it's because weather manipulation. No,
I'm going to
Because
jump right in.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump right in just because I've been looking at this so much and dealing with so many people with this because I'm a hurricane person, so they're all coming to me. And that is, I don't think they're related. I think the distrust of the government is the key factor, but it's this very slick. The file I sent you with the video you can look at later, if you watch it, you'll see why so many people are convinced. And I had a dear friend in Hollywood. He's a smart guy. And he wrote me when I told him it was garbage. He said, I was fooled. And this stuff is so slick. And some of these people, we don't know. I have a saying, you can watch someone's actions. It's another thing to know their motives, why these people are doing it, whether they believe it or they're deliberately deceptive. I don't know. But there was an article and they used our FAQ page, which I put on that slide. They used our FAQ page to show why this is not true that this stuff is happening. So it was a real good article about it. They said, but the ocean temperatures are getting warmer due to climate change, and therefore that's making hurricanes stronger. So they dismiss one thing and then embrace the other thing. So go ahead. I don't know if anybody else has something on this.
Well, I want to say it's also, I think it's broader than climate change. It's something that's maybe ingrained in the human genes. I don't know. It's fear and misunderstanding of new technologies. People who grew up when fossil fuels were dominant largely trust fossil fuels. And before they trusted chemicals as well. But now I see the same people who are putting up things about chemtrails and electromagnetic pulses. That's usually from the left, or not EMPs, but electromagnetic from power lines causing cancer. That's usually from the left. They're saying, oh, we got to go organic food. We got to get rid of, chemicals are bad in food. We got to go all organic. And they say you can't trust biotechnology. So they're basically people on the right. Some people on the right have become the new Luddites. They like the technologies they understood, but they don't trust the technologies that are coming on. And I just see them, so many of them saying just crazy things about, look, vaccines. Were there some iffy things about the vaccines that came in? Yeah, there were. But you know what? I'm glad I got a polio vaccine. I'm glad I take my tetanus shots. I'm glad that I never got the German measles. Vaccines that have been tested over the years are good, and you've got to watch the new ones, see if they're developed with new kinds of technologies, and then make a judgment for yourself. But don't suddenly question the whole idea of vaccines throughout history or technologies in agriculture or all of these things just because they're new. Just because they're new doesn't necessarily mean they're bad.
It's called careful science. And let me put two quotes together. One is the Goebbels quote that I mentioned. Goebbels, you repeat a lie enough, people will believe it. So this stuff is said, some of it so many times. And the other quote I first heard at a Heartland conference, it is far easier to deceive someone than to convince them they've been deceived. And once people start to grab hold of this stuff, it can be very hard to remove them from it. It really takes a lot of hard facts, and they have to trust them. And but it's sad. That's why I really wanted us to talk, and I'm glad we did, about all these rumors going out there that we're causing these horrible hurricanes. Like we've never seen these before. Yeah, that's the problem. It's man-made climate change. It's weather modification. It's like there's nothing new. This has been horrible. We just didn't have as much stuff on the coast in some areas and as many measurements.
Right. And I wanted to say too, because a family member of mine said this to me, and I think this is probably true, which is that, if the government could steer and create massive hurricanes, would they? And the answer to that, I think, is probably yes. But the fact that we don't see any trend that indicates that that's happening is pretty.
If we could get rid of them, we would get rid of them.
Yeah, if we could get rid of them.
No.
Yeah.
If we could control them, they'd be used in modern warfare. Hurricanes directed in modern warfare.
Listen, let me tell you a true story. We used to fly if we flew storms in the East Pacific, then we would fly usually from Mexico, Acapulco or Puerto Vallarta. I've been there a number of times. And at a certain point, Mexico wouldn't let us come there because they thought we were seeding the storms. Are you ready for this? And moving them away from Mexico. Why did they want the hurricanes? Because they need the rainfall. And I thought, boy, if we could do that, believe me, we'd be doing it in the U.S. and steering these things away. But we're still that. Go ahead.
No, wasn't controlling the weather the plot of a Bond film? Was it The World Is Not Enough? Isn't it the idea was they're going to control the weather, and if they could control the weather, they could control the world? I mean,
we've had a lot of those sci-fi things recently. I mean, and then there's Storm and the X-Men.
Yeah.
Right.
Going to movies, I prefer to think of the whole geoengineering thing like the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Who's working on geoengineering? Top men.
That's right. Top men.
Before there was Storm, there were witches that brought rain or plague to crops. Remember, people have always thought that supernatural entities could control or modify the weather.
Well, I think what the show has really done, and Anthony especially, well, Stan of course as well, is like I don't think people can really comprehend the power of nature and how puny humans and human activity is when it comes to the climate, like the power of CO2 to basically is the control knob of global temperature. That's just as false as the idea that puny humans can somehow seed and affect in any even remotely approaching a meaningful way a hurricane, for crying out loud. People just really don't understand the scope of our atmosphere, the scope of the earth, and the immense power of a storm like Milton and all these other hurricanes. It should be dismissed out of hand by anybody that uses any logic that man's ability to manipulate something of that immense size and power is literally impossible. In fact, it wouldn't even be a plot of a science fiction film. It's so absurd.
It's kind of like looking and saying like, okay, you can nuke a city. Therefore, and this is the cloud seeding to the hurricane seeding idea. You can nuke a city, therefore you could nuke the sun and destroy it.
Right.
Okay, let's hit this question here from Albert, who's a good viewer of ours, and he has a good question, which is, and I know that Stan is going to love this one again. How bad was Milton compared to Andrew?
Oh, well, first of all, Milton was stronger than Andrew when it was out at sea. So it reached winds. Actually, I don't know the flight. I think some surface winds were up to 180 miles an hour. So it was stronger than Andrew. It was very small like Andrew. But by the time it hit land, which we were hoping, it weakened. So Milton, if it was a Cat 3 at land, and again, they'll know in the post-process data, Andrew was a absolute Cat 5. And so Andrew not only did some storm surge, but I should bring up my Andrew picture that, it ripped. I was in a concrete block house. It ripped the entire roof off, carrying the concrete tie beam. And just did incredible devastation all over here from those kind of winds. So Milton wasn't anything like it. We've had some other Cat 5s that have hit areas. But by the way, Andrew was the only one that hit a major metropolitan area in all these Cat 5s that have hit.
Yeah, right. We've gone way over, so I don't think I can get to any more questions.
So much
Sorry
fun.
About that, guys.
Just one last question here, Stan. You could probably address this, you and Anthony, in literally 30 seconds. But why did Milton basically evaporate as soon as it hit the Atlantic? Water temperature here in northern Florida is around 78. Shouldn't that have, I guess the assumption, shouldn't that have refueled the hurricane?
Oh, no, it had plenty of warm water. There was what we call a warm water eddy nearby. It was some dry air was coming in. So you have all these things going on in the atmosphere. It was in an ideal situation near the Yucatan. Then as it got closer, we saw there was a cold front coming down. There was some dry air coming in. and there was higher vertical shear. Vertical shear is the difference between the lower and the upper level winds. And when the difference is really strong, it rips the hurricane apart. So all those things combine to weaken it. Whereas Andrew, as it approached land, everything got better for development and it intensified to a campfire. So we're very glad this weekend, believe me.
And we're very glad today to have you to have had you on the show, Stan Goldenberg, one of the great hurricane experts in the United States and frankly the entire globe. Second time on the show, and I'm sure it will not be the last. Maybe it's third time on the show.
Second time this year on the show. Yes.
Yes, second time in the last few months in hurricane.
And it's always an honor to be on Heartland. I'll say that as well.
And it's always great to have you on here, my friend. So we're just going to wrap it up for today. I just want to remind everybody to please like, share, and subscribe. And we had a very lively conversation among ourselves and with our audience in the chat. So if you have more things to add, you can leave comments. That's a good place to do that, and we will also read them as well. Please visit climateataglance.com. We have a whole section on hurricanes that will give you a primer on just what you need to know as you observe these storms on your own. Go to climaterealism.com. That is where the Heartland Institute debunks at least one BS story about the climate in the media every single day. Visit What's Up With That, which is the website run by our own Anthony Watts. And always go to heartland.org, where you can subscribe to our Climate Change Weekly newsletter. Thank you, Stan Goldenberg. Thank you, Sterling Burnett. Thank you, Anthony Watts. Thank you, Linnea. And thank you to our producer, Andy Singer, in the background. And thank you all for watching, and we will talk to you next week.
How dare you!